Good afternoon. My name is JJ Spoon, and I'm Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for European Studies at Pitt. Welcome to this month's Conversations on Europe. For today's conversation, we will be discussing Brexit. Our next conversation will be on February 18th and is part of our Year of Memory and Politics series, in which we'll be discussing monuments and contested memory in Europe and the US. Today's conversation is sponsored by the European Studies Center at the University Center of International Studies here. Our co-sponsors are the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at Florida International University, the European Union Center at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at the University of Florida, and the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies at Georgia Tech. Thank you to my colleague Iris Matijevich for her help in organizing today's event. It's been 3.5 years since British voters voted to leave the European Union in the June 2016 referendum. During this time, the UK has had 3 prime ministers, 2 general elections, and several rounds of negotiations with the EU. With Boris Johnson's Conservative Party winning over 56% of the seats in the December 2019 election, he now has the support he needs to move forward with exiting the EU. The House of Commons subsequently passed the EU withdrawal bill. Although the House of Lords added 3 amendments to the bill just yesterday, including giving the EU citizens the automatic right to stay in the UK after Brexit and ensure that they can obtain physical proof of their rights, it is likely that the House of Commons, given their large majority, will overturn these amendments. The UK is thus set to leave the EU on January 31st. With me today are several experts who will help us to unpack what all of this means and what we can expect after January 31st, which is coming up in 10 days. As I'm sure there are lots of questions from our audience, both here with me in Pittsburgh and those joining us remotely, there will be plenty of time for Q&A later in the conversation. I'd like now to introduce our experts. First, Anand Menon is Professor of European Politics and Foreign Affairs at King's College London and Director of the UK in a Changing Europe initiative, which has been at the forefront of investigating the ever-changing relationship between the UK and the European Union. He received his PhD from the University of Oxford. Dr. Menon has written widely on many aspects of EU politics and policy and on UK-EU relations, and is a frequent contributor to the media on matters relating to British relations with the EU. Next, I'm pleased to have Timothy McMahon, who is an associate professor in the Department of History at Marquette University. He is the past president of the American Conference for Irish Studies. He received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. McMahon is a social historian with interests in nationalism and national identity, popular culture, especially popular religion, modern Ireland, and the British Empire. He's the author of Grand Opportunity, The Gaelic Revival and Irish Society, 1893 to 1910, the co-editor of Ireland in an Imperial World, Citizenship, Opportunism, and Subversion, and is currently working on a book manuscript on Irish partition and its impact on identities across the island. And I'm also joined by my colleague Pablo Fernandez-Vasquez, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pittsburgh. He received his PhD from New York University. His research focuses on political representation in general and on the credibility of party campaign communication and the most effective strategies to curb corruption in Europe and in Latin America. Dr. Fernandez-Vasquez's work has been published in several journals, including the Journal of Politics, the British Journal of Political Science, Comparative Political Studies, and Party Politics. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us today. To get us started, Anand, I thought maybe you could give us a bit of a brief overview of how we got to where we are today.
Oh, God. Well, I mean, I can talk about the referendum itself later on if you want, but I mean, the referendum matters because actually one of the curious things in British politics now is that British politics is very focused on the reasons why people voted leave now. So the future will be shaped by how people are interpreting the referendum. But what's happened over the last 3 years, I think, well, a couple of things worth saying. I mean, firstly, it was always going to be hard. Whoever the Prime Minister, whatever the size of their majority, leaving the European Union is a nightmare thing to do because it's complex. So it was never, ever going to be straightforward. It was made more difficult by the fact that we had the Prime Minister we had, someone who was sort of pathologically unable to either share information even with her cabinet or make decisions, and by the fact that halfway through, just less than halfway through the process, she lost her majority. So you ended up with a hung parliament as well. And of course, it's worth bearing in mind that Brexit divides our political parties down the middle. That meant that the normal rules of British politics inside Parliament simply ceased to apply. I mean, one of the interesting things you experience in Britain now, particularly with sort of students and younger people, is they look at the Boris Johnson majority government and say, God, this is weird. But actually, no, it's not weird. It's totally normal. This is what our Parliament and our politics is meant to look like. It's just that over the last 3 years, people have got a completely sort of different impression of it. So at the end of these 3.5 years, there have been several outcomes. I mean, one, because of the election, we'll leave the European Union. Two, we have a country that is enormously polarized over the Brexit issue, to the point where, a lot of this is reminiscent of American culture wars. We did some survey work about a year ago in which we found that, under 50% of Remainers would rent a room to a Leave voter. About 58% of Remainers would be very or quite upset if one of their kids married a Leave voter. So the polarization is down the middle and it's very, very deep. And a country where actually a lot of the frustration is focused on politics. One of the most depressing elements of the last general election was that, to a greater or lesser extent, both the big parties ran on recognisably populist platforms. So Boris Johnson was the people versus Parliament, and Jeremy Corbyn was the people versus the establishment. And that resonates in Britain partly because it took 3.5 years, in the view of many, for the politicians to get the message and do what the public had told them to do. Is that
Thank
enough?
you very much for that. Sure. Yes. No, thank you. No, that's good. You could talk for, obviously, all of us could talk for a very long time. So just to set the stage, then, if we could talk a bit about what is going to happen in 10 days from today, before we get into some of the specifics and the implications. So we know that Brexit is likely to happen, as far as I know, and nothing has changed in the last 10 minutes, on the 31st. So what does that actually look like in terms of when British citizens wake up on the morning of January 31st? What is that going to look like? So Pablo, would you like to?
So I guess until the end of this year, my understanding is that most of the consequences are not going to be felt. So we're still going to be in a process of negotiation for several months to come, and so it's not going to be felt yet. But the negotiations that are going to happen during the rest of the year are going to be very interesting, in the sense that the UK has a very clear, or the UK government has a very clear position. They don't want to be part of the customs union. They don't want to be part of the single market, and so essentially the position. This will make things easier, in the sense that it's constraining the room for bargaining, in the sense that the only viable option, given the constraints that the negotiators are setting on the table, is that it's a free trade agreement, a Canada-style free trade agreement. Now, the question is that with that kind of free trade agreement, the European Union is saying, wait a minute, sure, but we want to ensure what the Commission calls, or Michel Barnier and his task force calls, a level playing field, so that if goods from the UK can come in, we have to ensure that there's no regulatory dumping on the part of the UK, in the sense of lowering environmental standards, lowering taxes for firms, etc., which could increase the competitiveness of UK firms vis-a-vis European Union ones, and so that's the fight that is going to happen in the next few months.
Anand, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, it's absolutely true that the only thing. I mean, remember, the British relationship with the European Union is both very deep and very broad. And the notion that this can be negotiated satisfactorily in a year is for the birds, quite frankly. So things like security, policing cooperation, things like that, which have been hideously overlooked to date, look like being left to phase 2, which is going to have some pretty hideous consequences, I think, in terms of law enforcement. But even on the narrow terrain of the economics, it is very hard to see how anything more than a bare bones deal can be negotiated in the timescale that Boris Johnson has forced upon himself. I don't think he's going to extend transition, incidentally, so I think this time frame is real. And as was just said, even if you're talking about a very bare bones agreement, so let's just imagine the British government were to say, we just like a tariff and quota-free deal on goods, the EU will still say, that's great, but you have to sign up to certain level playing field conditions of a kind the Prime Minister has indicated he's not minded to do. Now, we can argue about this. I personally think that, one of the implications of what's happening at the moment is that famous Michel Barnier staircase was actually fundamentally dishonest, because none of those options, Canada, Switzerland, Norway, were actually on offer to us, because they would offer us that plus a whole load of add-ons because we're close and we're big, and the French and the Italians and the Dutch to a lesser extent see us as a competitor. But actually finding a landing zone between us and them now, I think, is going to be very, very hard indeed. And the other issue, of course, is ratification, which we haven't talked about much to date, but I think is interesting. Remember, this is the first deal in the history of ever whose sole purpose is to make trade more difficult. All right? And when it comes to selling trade deals to Parliament, you have to be able to sell wins. There are going to be precious few wins coming out of the Brexit negotiations for either side. So I suspect in the 27 national parliaments, if it's a mixed agreement and they have to give their approval, it's not necessarily going to be plain sailing.
Could I
thank you. And I think yes, please do.
So the other thing that I think further complicates the matter is that the Johnson administration has also made clear that they would like to negotiate a new trade agreement with the United States. And the United States is coming at things from a very different perspective than the EU. And if level playing field is going to be one of the things that the EU wants to keep in mind, how does any American deal shape that? And just a second point related to that, and to build on what Anand just said, if we think about how difficult it's been for the United States, Canada, and Mexico to renegotiate what had been NAFTA into the new agreement that was just, signed off on last week. That was a 3-year process, and that was with people who were already in a free trade situation. And now you're talking about, as Anand just said, moving into a more complicated and less free situation, with still a third major party and a second type of agreement to complicate things. So the timeline that Johnson has set forward is absolutely beyond any sense of reality.
Thank you, Tim. I want to go back to something that you mentioned in terms of thinking about the relationship or the potential relationship and how things are going to change between the U.S. and the U.K. In other words, how is this transatlantic relationship going to evolve once the UK is not part of the European Union? So, Tim, do you want to pick up on that? And then, Anand, I think you may have something.
So, if I could get extremely parochial here, one of the areas that is going to shape this also is the island of Ireland. In part because the United States Congress has said that it will not endorse any kind of trade agreement with the UK that weakens the Belfast Agreement of 1998. So the agreement that more or less, and I'm gonna be very wishy-washy on that, more or less ended the troubles of the 1960s through 1990s. That agreement essentially established a more open border on the island of Ireland, and also involved the Republic of Ireland in some domestic affairs in Northern Ireland. Of course, the Republic is a part of the EU. One of the complicating factors in the withdrawal agreement was how to handle that border situation. So the American angle, if you will, is made all that much more complex by the status of the two entities on the island of Ireland. And obviously that's also had ramifications for the way the withdrawal agreement was negotiated, and I'm sure we'll get into that over the next few minutes.
Yeah. Anand, do you have anything you want to pick up on the transatlantic relationship?
The one obvious point, I suppose, is just how staggeringly clueless we are about what the Johnson government intends to do in virtually any area, whether it's domestically or internationally. Britain really hasn't had a foreign policy since we tried and failed to intervene in Syria. We've just not talked about it in any kind of systematic way. And of course, several of our foreign secretaries just didn't want to do the job, so they didn't do it. So it is very hard to know where our foreign policy is and very hard to know where it's going to go. The signs so far are interesting, aren't they? Because from that Biarritz summit that he attended way back last, when he first became Prime Minister, through to him signing up with the E3 statement on Iran, Boris Johnson has tacked, and of course, Iran's important because Iran immediately presents us with a test case of whether, in extremis, the UK will lean towards Europe or the United States. We've lent a little bit towards Europe whilst making nice noises towards the United States at the moment. I just genuinely don't know, and I'm not sure many people do. If he's forced to make a choice, what the Prime Minister will do, it is incredibly important politically for him to strike a trade deal with the United States. It almost doesn't matter what that trade deal says. I mean, the trade deal could simply say, you know, the United States and the United Kingdom have decided to trade more together, you know, sign Boris and Donald. He'll bring it home and wave it around because it's the political impact. So much of our politics now is about symbolism. He needs that piece of paper. And he knows how tremendously unpredictable your president is. So he'll be loath to get on the wrong side of the United States, but at the moment he's playing a very, very difficult balancing act. And I think in Downing Street, they must be hoping and praying that the Iran crisis goes away or quietens down so that they can avoid difficult choices. Because at the moment, we are confronted with a lot of choices. And exactly as was just said, when it comes to a trade deal, we face the same choices. If we want to make the concessions that the Americans want to sign a trade deal with us, the Europeans are going to say, over my dead body. I mean, the sort of touchstone issue in this country is chlorinated chicken, which everyone is talking about. No one knows what it is, but we've decided it doesn't sound very tasty. And you know, that is a cipher for a real argument about regulation, about whether we think of the Americans as basically being a little bit unhealthy with no standards. Okay, so a trade deal with America here means a deal with no regulatory standards involved. All right. And that's how the debate is playing out in this country at the moment. And the government is going to have to tread a very, very careful path because it'll be very, very hard to do both deals satisfactorily and all too easy to see how the interplay between the two sets of negotiations lead to both of them collapsing.
On that uplifting note, I wonder if we can spend a bit of time talking about what the implications are, right? We know that there's lots of unknowns. Of course we know that, but of course there's also lots of discussion about what the implications are for the average British citizen, the average Irish citizen, for the economy, for the National Health Service, as well as Europeans, of course, living in the UK. So, and I know that obviously is something that those many in the room and many people I talk to were very interested. All of these kind of big picture things aside, what is the implications of this really for the average person? So I wonder, Tim, if you want to perhaps start with this, kind of give perhaps a sense in however you want to go with this, kind of what some of those implications may be.
Okay, well, so to think very parochially about the Irish case, there are potential wins and potential losses here. For the average person, loss is going to be the operative word. For big business, potentially wins because, of course, depending on the shape of the way the exit of the UK goes, you're going to have some businesses that may choose to move office to Dublin or to some other part of Ireland, partly because of the corporate tax code being so favorable. I mean, you already saw, for example, in I think it was late 2017, Thomson Reuters announced that their $300 billion per day foreign derivatives operation was going to move from London to Dublin. So, I mean, that was a major win. But if we think about, for example, just basic trade issues, something like 12% of Irish goods are traded directly to the British market. And in certain sectors, that number's even higher. 40% of Irish agricultural goods are traded into Britain. 50% of Irish beef exports go to Britain. depending on how the negotiations go, this could have a devastating impact on those sectors. Let's say no deal is struck. Let's say things fall back to sort of a worst case trade scenario, and you're put on, World Trade Organization lines. British or Irish beef could be subject to 50% tariffs coming into the UK. I mean, that's a huge hit. One estimate claimed as well, if we start talking about goods flowing back into Ireland from Britain, one estimate claimed that in a hard Brexit scenario, the average grocery bill could go up by 52% in the Republic of Ireland. So, I mean, that's a dramatic and fundamental problem. Now, in Northern Ireland, things are also potentially dire. One estimate from the Northern Ireland Economics Office suggested that something on the order of 40,000 jobs could be lost in a no-deal situation. Basically, every representative organization, from farmers to business people in Northern Ireland, have been very much against leaving. This is another element to the question that I think that maybe we'll get into over the course of our time, and that is how might Brexit reshape the United Kingdom? That's a fundamental question, not just in Northern Ireland, but Scotland as well.
Thank you. Pablo?
So one of the interesting aspects of the potential economic consequences of Brexit would be what happens in those areas that have now voted conservative in the last election, right? They could be particularly impacted, I guess, particularly so if there is no comprehensive trade agreement. And so that's one of the things that I find that could be potentially interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Anand, I wonder if you could talk a bit about sort of what is potentially what are we going to see for all of the European citizens that are living and working in the UK? Obviously, the House of Lords yesterday voted to ensure that they have the right to stay, but do we think that, are we going to see fewer people moving in, people leaving? How is this really going to affect the economy, universities, etc.?
Well, I mean, there are several layers to this. EU citizens who are already here at the time of exit are able to apply for this thing called settled status. Now, the issues here are largely administrative, which is to say that basically the system is clunky. A lot of these people don't have the requisite paperwork. A lot of people are getting turned down who shouldn't be turned down. That is messy, but I suspect the government will try and make that okay because the government is committed to letting these people achieve settled status. On people coming here, we don't know what the immigration regime for Europeans will be. I'm pretty certain at the moment the government will make it the same as for everyone, because one of the arguments was we shouldn't discriminate. I mean, one of the curious arguments from the referendum campaign is why should we discriminate in favour of Europeans when we've got the rest of the world as well, which is one reason why a significant and perhaps surprising number of Asians in the UK voted Brexit. We've already seen a significant drop in the number of Europeans coming here. We've seen it having an economic effect in sectors like the National Health Service and nursing. Anecdotally, you hear stories from universities about people pulling out of job searches from continental Europe because they either don't like the atmosphere in the UK. I mean, there are three forces, aren't there, in the UK that make it less appealing. There is uncertainty about the future and what the arrangements will be in the future. There is what is seen as a negative attitude towards immigrants in this country, though let's face it, you've got to spoil for choice in Europe if you want to avoid that. And finally, the fact that the pound is worth 20% less against the euro than it was at the time we left. So if you're interested in sending money home, you're sending far less money home if you work here than if you work in France or Germany. So there has been a drop-off in numbers. Can I just say something about the economic? I know I promise not to talk very much from here on in, but can I say something about the economic? I mean, there's two or three things. I mean, firstly, to paraphrase a well-known phrase, it's the politics, stupid. I mean, the defining thing about Brexit is it's the triumph of politics over economics. So for those of us whose knee-jerk reaction it is to say, but hang on, that will be bad for the economy, so they won't do it, you're living in the wrong country. That logic does not apply in this country anymore. It seems to me that the government has basically accepted the fact that we will do a Brexit and it will be harmful for the economy. It'll be harmful. I mean, we've done some forecasts on this. Even under the terms of the deal that Boris Johnson gets, you're talking about a hit to GDP per capita of between 3 and 7.5% over 10 years. That's massive. Okay, it's absolutely huge, and it's not that much smaller than the hit under WTO terms. But, and this is the third thing I want to say, how this plays out politically is far from clear for several reasons. Firstly, there is no such thing as the average citizen. Okay, so the effects will vary tremendously, and the effects will be mediated by what government does. If central government says to itself, okay, we're doing a thin Brexit deal, which means manufacturing in the West Midlands, in the north of England, in all those new Conservative seats that were Labour seats, will get hit. We're going to plough money into them, into training, into investment, into infrastructure. That might, in the short term, mitigate the impact. And you've got to think Rust Belt here, okay? If you have a government that says the Rust Belt has been ignored for far too long, we're going to start some building projects, we might all know that in aggregate economic terms, the impact of that is going to be paltry. Voters in those places might say, my God, we finally got a government that cares about us. We should give them the benefit of the doubt and give them a second term. And that is the sort of gamble that the Johnson government is making, that yes, the aggregates are all negative. Everything's in the red when it comes to Brexit. Why wouldn't it be? That Brexit is making trade with your nearest and largest trading partner harder than it was. So it's going to have a negative impact. That's not rocket science. But the way that the economic impact plays out politically is, I think, a really interesting. I think political scientists haven't thought about this enough, to be honest. But it's not clear to me that it's a losing gamble politically for the Prime Minister.
So something that just came to mind right now. So there are always discussions about compensating the losers from trade deals, right? And so the interesting thing here would be compensating the losers from losing trade, right? And the interesting thing here is that I guess what Anand was just mentioning before, right? So this all hinges on the capacity of the UK to have the fiscal capacity to actually implement these compensatory policies, right? And so it's in part it's going to depend on the evolution of the economy one way or another, I guess. Mm-hmm. Or otherwise the trade-offs are going to be just very big.
Well, let me just add a couple of things to that. I mean, firstly, yes, you're right, though I think given that borrowing costs are quite low and that there's a degree of fiscal headroom, we're not going to run out of money. I don't think it's going to be a shortage of money that's the problem. I think it's what we lack in this country, and I think we'll see this over the next 2 or 3 years, is in the public sector, we don't have the project management capability to spend the money. It's a bit like EU regional funds being pumped into Bulgaria, all right, which is great, but ultimately, when you see those funds end up in the right. I mean, that's a bad example. I mean, I don't know, yeah, but it's a bit like that. If you're
persuaded the UK to Bulgaria,
suddenly going to open the tap, right, you need to be damn sure that you have the capacity in place to spend that money properly or well. Otherwise, it's just money wasted. Money down the drain, if you want to go back to the tap. So that's what worries me, is that A, it's not clear to me that the government knows what it wants to do with this money, apart from shiny new infrastructure it can point to. I mean, one of the paradoxes of this is the British government will do what for many years we failed to do with the European Union, which is whenever something is paid for out of public money, we'll put a bloody big sign up saying this was paid for by Boris for you, which we never did for EU funding projects. So it's about the politics, but whether in real terms there's an impact is going to depend on how well we can spend the money. And I've got serious doubts. I mean, given our recent history with infrastructure, I mean, we haven't taken an infrastructure decision for what seems like an eternity. We can't decide on Heathrow. We can't decide on the new rail line. So we can't make the decisions because of planning laws. And if we make the decision, we can't spend the money effectively because we tend to screw up. That, I think, is where the problems are going to come down the line.
Sorry.
That's probably the new UK firewall kicking in.
Yeah.
Or aliens.
Stop the discussion.
On that note, I want to turn to, Tim, something you mentioned and several questions that I wanted us to get to, which is really how the potential for the UK being reshaped, both from the Irish perspective and obviously also from the Scottish perspective. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit. Obviously, we know that the Northern Ireland, as you have mentioned, and has been very much in the conversation because of the border, right? That obviously is something that's largely played out in terms of where that frontier is going to be between the UK and the EU. So first, if you could talk a bit about that, and then I think also sort of just more largely how if we're going to perhaps see increased return to conflict in Northern Ireland once Brexit happens, and then we can talk about a united Ireland now or later as well. So lots of things to go on there, but
okay. So a couple of things to start with. First of all, I would say that to build off of what Anand was saying with regard to economics, I think with regard to identity questions, most Brexit voters voted in favor of Brexit regardless of the impact it would have in other parts of the UK. So we need to remember that the way that the vote broke down in 2016, essentially Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain, Northern Ireland voted heavily to remain, the city voted to remain, and then the rest of England and Wales essentially voted to leave. The overall total was 51.9% to leave, but Scotland, it was well over 60% to remain. Northern Ireland, it was about 56% to remain. And part of the reason for that was the danger that within Northern Ireland, the danger, the prospect of leaving the EU, particularly a crash out from the EU, would have on the peace process and the sustained relative peace that's existed there since the late 1990s. To put this into perspective, I mean, to complicate what that border is, the border on the island of Ireland is about 310 miles long. There are 208 formal crossings, but the Irish Army has estimated that if you look at things like slips, like on the same farm, the border might cut through it, and there might be a pathway that the farmer uses that's not a formal crossing. There's more than 300 formal crossings. And if you look at the eastern end of the EU, essentially from Norway down to Romania, there are fewer crossings on that whole stretch than there is just on the Irish border. In terms of sort of lorries crossing the border with goods on a daily basis, there's like 13,000 crossings, right? So policing that stretch of ground is incredibly complex. Managing that from the standpoint of trade is incredibly complex. And the people on the ground there know this, right? I mean, you can be walking down a street that looks on a map like it's a straight line, and you're actually crossing the border 5 or 6 times in a 5-mile stretch, right? That's not an exaggeration. The fact is that the county lines that were drawn in the 16th century, some of them go back earlier than that, but essentially the shiring in Ireland took place in the 16th century. Those now become an international border, right? I mean, they became an international border in the 1920s. That was mitigated through common membership in the EU and through the peace agreement in 1998. But now that's all in question. You've seen small groups of hardline Republicans threaten violence. You've seen hardline loyalists, if you will, Protestant paramilitaries, pro-British paramilitaries threaten to reactivate if there's any Republican violence. So this is a very real issue. Just to underscore that one last point, last winter and spring, when Theresa May's deal was approaching its votes and its demise, you actually had a couple of small bombs go off, for instance, in Londonderry, Londonderry. Essentially, the so-called real IRA trying to say that they still existed. They weren't designed necessarily to destroy a lot of property or kill a lot of people, but basically just to say, here we are. So that's a significant question. Now, both the British government and the Irish government have intervened to try and give more control to people on the ground in Northern Ireland. You've just seen in the past 2 weeks, the Northern Ireland Assembly has come back into operation. And in fact, one of their first significant votes just yesterday was essentially a unanimous vote to oppose the withdrawal agreement. So if there's one thing that has united parties, albeit for different reasons, across the political divide in Northern Ireland, it's that they would prefer not to leave.
Okay, thank you. So I guess the next question, coming from that, and Pablo and I feel free to jump in as well, is the question over a potential united Ireland. I know that as far as I understand, that the current Irish Prime Minister is not necessarily that interested in that. But we know that there are elections coming up in a couple of weeks in Ireland and the Republic, so how that may change. And then also to bring in Scotland into the conversation. We know that Scotland had a referendum back in 2014. It did not pass. This would be to leave the United Kingdom. Part of what the Scottish National Party campaigned on back in the December election was holding another secession referendum. Boris Johnson last week said no. Nicola Sturgeon, the head of the SNP, the First Minister, sent in a request and he sent it back. So where are we on this question of what the UK may look like, and if we are going to see some of these move forward? Anand, do you want to take that first?
I mean, the short, honest answer is we don't know. I mean, in terms of Ireland, yes, the debate has become a bit more urgent around Irish unity because of Brexit. There is no intra-Irish border as a result of the deal that's been struck, which takes some of the pressure off. And there is a lot of hostility to the idea on both sides, actually, of a united Ireland. So I think the day we have a united Ireland has probably come closer because of Brexit, but I don't think we're going to see it in the immediate future, though that debate is real. And, you know, there are people in the government in Dublin who are tasked to think about how this works and how it doesn't work. Scotland's interesting because Brexit has had two sort of opposite impacts on Scotland. In the first place, Brexit has strengthened the emotional appeal of Scottish independence. Amongst those wavering and amongst people who were SNP supporters anyway, what Brexit does is it underlines what they already knew. The English are total bastards. We're ripping them out of Europe. We're wrecking their economy, even though they voted to stay in. So on an emotional level, Brexit has been a very effective recruiting sergeant for the independence cause. Not massively so, but to the point where there was a poll a few weeks ago that put it at 50-50. And it's the first poll since that one rogue poll during the referendum in 2014 that put it at 50-50. And the SNP did very, very well in the election in December. Now, so that's the positive case. But the paradox about Brexit is whilst it's made the emotional case for independence a lot stronger, it's arguably made the practical case for independence far, far harder. Why? Because if Boris Johnson gets the sort of deal he's after, which is no customs union, no single market, as soon as Scotland becomes independent, and then we assume it'll try and join the European Union, you will have exactly the same conversation about a border between Scotland and England as we've had about the border between either one of the two islands or between Northern Ireland and GB. And the thing is, whilst we can remember the days of a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, though not fondly, most of us here cannot conceive of a border between Scotland and England. And I suspect the SNP know this, and they know that that will be a hard sell in any referendum. So what they're trying to do, I mean, the SNP played a slightly dirty game in the election campaign in the sense that it was quite clear to me that what they really wanted was them to do well in Scotland and Boris Johnson to do well in England. So whenever Boris Johnson came up and said, if you don't vote for me, you get a coalition of chaos with Corbyn and Sturgeon, Nicola Sturgeon would pop up on the telly an hour later and say, oh yes, and incidentally, if I'm supporting Jeremy Corbyn, we have to get rid of all our nuclear weapons within half an hour. So playing into the Johnson narrative, if you like, because this is the best of all worlds for the SNP now. You have a right-wing Tory government under someone the Scots hate in London. You have a hard Brexit, and it maximises their potential to do well in an independence referendum. My suspicion is there are elections in Scotland in 2021. The UK government will not allow them to have a referendum before that date, but if the SNP do very well in that election in 2021, it'll be very hard for the UK government to say no. One final thing, I think this week or next week, the trial starts of former SNP leader Alex Salmond for sexual harassment of sexual assault. Now, there are all sorts of rumours doing the rounds that Nicholas knew more about this than she let on, that they are going to call her as a witness in the trial, and actually, for the SNP, there is a leadership contest being practiced for amongst SNP politicians at the moment. If that trial goes badly for the SNP, it could be disastrous, so we'll just have to wait and see. But that, incidentally, is the sole reason why the SNP was supportive of the idea of an election before Christmas, because they knew that this trial was coming up in January.
The plot thickens. Thank you, Pablo.
Yeah, just following up on this, right? So from a comparative point of view, right, this question of having secession referendums every 5-6 years is rather odd, right? So there's this idea that these are decisions that should be consequential and standing decisions that you can go over them every fortnight. And so from that point of view, it makes sense to Johnson's reply makes sense. At the same time, the pro-independent side has a point in saying, well, the context has significantly changed, so we're not in 2014 anymore. But to follow up on the previous point, right? So with the UK being out of the EU, right? So Scotland cannot say, oh, we become independent. And this is something that Catalonia also, so pro-independence politicians in Catalonia said, well, we're part of the European Union. If we secede, we'll still be part of the European Union, right? So this was the paradox of being part of the European Union might potentially increase demands for secession. But once you're out, it becomes a lot more uncertain what that would mean for Scotland economically, right? So you would be out of the UK, you would have the border with the UK, and then how long would it take before you're actually part of the EU, a full member of the EU again? That's very uncertain, right? And so
you wouldn't.
Also
So you wouldn't need the border till you were in the EU.
Right. It's interesting too how the interplay among the different entities has played out over time. I mean, you go back to the Scottish referendum in 2014, and of course one of the cards that David Cameron played was essentially to work it so that the EU said Scotland would not automatically be admitted to the EU, and that in many ways pressured Scots voters to think a little bit more about what the implications of independence were all about. To go back to the Irish situation, there's a couple of things to keep in mind too. There's no going forward with any kind of united Ireland unless and until a majority of people in Northern Ireland vote that they're interested in doing that, right? As a constituent part of the United Kingdom and by treaty and in law, until that happens, there is no discussion about uniting. But the other side of this is that a majority of people in the Republic have to be willing to take on new citizens as well. And there hasn't been that type of discussion and what the implications of that would be. And while most parties in the Irish Republic are committed to the notion long term of uniting the island, the practical side of that has never been dealt with. I would flip that around again to the Northern Irish side. I mean, one of the central institutions in the United Kingdom, of course, is the National Health Service. The NHS, frankly, performs better than the Irish Health Service does. And you know, if I were a voter in Northern Ireland, that might actually be something that would make me scratch my head and say, is being a part of a united Ireland the way to go? That takes me back then to you know, Anand's point, the question of, you know, economic rationality versus whatever the emotional side of making such decisions has to do. And I mean, I think that's something that really all of us need to wrestle with, whether, you know, you're a historian like me or a political scientist or a sociologist. When you look at the phenomenon, especially of nationalism and national identity, what is the balancing point between emotion and rationality? And the fact of the matter is that for a lot of people, the emotional trumps, that pun intended, the intellectual. And you know, so how we sort that through polls or through campaigning is something that is really going to, I think, shape our discussion over the next decade to 15 years. But I mean, I really wouldn't be surprised if we see first a Scottish referendum and then also a border referendum, north and south in Ireland. But I think they'll go in that order. I think you'll actually see the Scottish first before you actually see Irish referendum. But that, I mean, I'm a historian. I'm not a citizen.
All right. Well, on that note, I want, before getting into some discussion on recent elections and sort of changing politics in the UK, I want to give everyone here and joining us remotely a chance to ask any questions up to this point. If you have a question for a specific panelist, just direct it to that person, or just in general, and then they can duke it out who would like to. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Hi, I would like to ask a question to everybody. I would like to ask about the dimension of the regulation of financial markets in terms of all the shifts that Brexit will bring, and also the interrelated aspects of money laundering and corruption. So what would you say about that? Thank you.
Thank you. Financial markets and corruption. Who would like to?
I mean,
go ahead.
It affects the UK in the sense that we don't know what arrangement we're going to strike with the European Union. If we don't strike any deal on financial services, we can do whatever we want. So if we want to, encourage money laundering, they can't stop us, which I doubt. Well, I hope we don't want to do. But anyway, just hypothetically, the British government wants to get something called equivalence from the European Union, which basically means that under a host of areas, and regulations of things like money laundering fall under these, the EU allows us basically to trade in and with their market on the basis of accepting our regulations as being close enough to theirs to be acceptable. The problem with equivalence for financial service firms is the EU reserves the right to end it with a month's notice. So equivalence is uncertainty forever. Okay, it means that, yes, we've left the European Union, yes, we're not directly under the court, but if we change our rules, they by they I usually mean the French in these cases, can turn around and say, hang on a sec, that's not good enough, you're going to have to lose your access to our market, which is a big deal for the City of London, okay? So a lot will hinge on whether the two sides can come to sort of an agreement on a kind of enhanced equivalence, which doesn't give us 30 days sort of notice, but gives us something more. And that will determine the degree to which our rules remain aligned or not. I think the UK was quite good actually at sort of talking about the need to tackle things like money laundering and secrecy in the EU. Some of the smaller member states like Luxembourg were far less good. That debate in the EU won't change with our absence, I don't think. One of the interesting things about Brexit is I think the big structural problems that beset the European Union won't really change because they didn't really involve us first and foremost anyway.
Right.
Thanks.
I have a question about the transition period. Some of you said that the day after, or January 31st, nothing much will happen because you're going to have this long transition period. And there's a set period, but then it's going to take 3 years to negotiate it. But I'm not quite sure I understand how that would be, because that either it means that the British are going to be accepting what the EU demands, or the EU is going to have to accept whatever Britain wants to send in. And at the same time, the extension of that is that we've learned over this last couple of years that the EU has no incentive to give the UK a good deal, right? And so we would expect them to drive a harder bargain. So I can't understand what's going to happen for this, what now might be a long transition period if what you said is so hard about making this deal.
I think. Sorry.
No, go.
So just a quick comment. So one of the interesting things about the bargaining process that is going to happen now is that one of the hopes, or my understanding is that one of the hopes on the part of the Johnson cabinet would be of splitting the European Union and essentially getting a better bargain. But the problem is that the basic demand of the European Union, that of a level playing field, it would benefit everybody in the European Union, right? So because it would essentially prevent the UK from obtaining a unfair competitive advantage, right? And everybody in the European Union would benefit from that. Of course, these benefits are asymmetric, so some countries will benefit more than others, but still, from at least the way I see it, it's hard to see Johnson being able to split the European Union and getting advantages out of it.
Anand, do you want to add something?
I think politically, I find it very, very hard indeed to see the Prime Minister asking for an extension of transition. Remember, under the terms of the withdrawal agreement, the formal request has to be in before the end of June. I see absolutely zero chance of that happening. Now, it might be that the Brits and the Europeans in the second half of the year have a minor panic attack and think we need to come up with a way of extending transition whilst calling it something completely different so that people are fooled. I don't know if they'll do that. I don't know if the EU will let us do that. And I don't know if there's any mechanism under the EU legal system where they can do that. But my assumption at the moment is we're talking till the end of December, after which transition will probably end. I have a slight sort of comment on the basis of the question, which is the EU have no incentive to compromise. I think the EU do have an incentive to compromise. I think both sides do, and it applies equally to both sides, in the sense that wrecking the UK-EU relationship, which a bare-bones FTA might do because it will cause significant economic harm to both sides, more to us, admittedly, runs a risk of fraying the security relationship at a time when the last thing we need in the West is a fraying of security ties between major Western security players. My problem with the European Union is that it often, I mean, in a sense, the model for what the EU has done to the UK is the way the EU treats any of its neighbours in any negotiations with its neighbours that don't want to join. It basically doesn't negotiate, it sets down terms and expects the other side to sign up to them. That's what led the EU to be quite short. You know, the EU negotiated that deal with Ukraine and forgot about Russia in the process, which kind of sums up the EU's approach to neighbourhood policy, which is it forgets geopolitics, it forgets medium and long-term interests, it focuses on its rule book. And I think actually there's a real danger here that in the UK for political reasons and on the EU side for narrow legal reasons, both sides lose sight of the bigger picture, which is that this is a valuable relationship in economic and security terms that everyone has an interest in preserving as far as possible.
Thank you. We can take one more question at this point.
Well, let me ask a question then, because we've been focusing obviously on Brexit. The question then is the future of Europe, future of the European Union. Depending on how it obviously negotiates its trade agreements with Britain and all the other issues, but does the EU look at this history, this recent history with Britain, and feel that perhaps their approach to, as you've just indicated, their approach towards new potential members, but is it something that they meaning the Commission and so on, feel that maybe they need to make adjustments, reforms within the European Union to avoid this sort of split in the future with some other member country? In other words, have they learned anything from this that would suggest that they need to reform or change its own internal structure and policy approach to its member countries?
So one of the most One of the most striking things about many on the EU side is they see the Brexit negotiations to date as a triumph, not because of the substance, but because the EU maintained its unity. So actually, the aim is unity rather than the aim is a specific sort of relationship with the UK. So there's been very, very little in the way of self-reflection on the part of the European Union about this. I'd actually hazard a guess and say that out of the 27 member states, only one of them, which is the Republic of Ireland, has had a really deep think about the medium and long-term relationship they want to have with the United Kingdom. I think everyone else has been happy to let the Commission deal with this negotiation. Member states have been noticeably absent from the whole process because they've got other fish to fry, other priorities to deal with. And no one is being as reflective as your question suggested, to be perfectly honest. I think in this country, it is probably only a matter of time before we have a public inquiry into the last 3.5 years, which will be great fun.
Yeah. Just to add on to that, I mean, a couple of things strike me. First of all, that from the EU's perspective, unity has been the primary benchmark, right? And so that goes back to the previous question about how the UK has assumed that it might be able to split people off. I mean, if the last 3 years have been a test of their ability to split people off, so that different states are going to approach the question in different ways, the EU has passed in that it has passed as a unified whole. To build on the question of the rethink of an individual state, in this particular case, the Republic of Ireland, one of the things that's been very interesting, I think, about the last quarter century, but especially evident in the last 3 years, is that Ireland has really emerged as a state independent in its own right. I mean, I think I first saw this on the ground, especially in 2011, when you had the very symbolic two happenings of Queen Elizabeth II visiting the first time the independent Irish state in a formal state visit. And you also had questions about clerical sex abuse, and the then Taoiseach Enda Kenny saying about relationships with Rome, we're the Republic of Ireland, not the Republic of Rome. You had this state that traditionally had had such a strong connection with the Catholic Church, essentially saying this is beyond anything that we could have been okay with. And that they were within 2 months of each other, you had these things going on. And to me, that was sort of a marker of, the Republic having come to a place diplomatically and also socially where they saw themselves in a very different place than they had even as recently as the early to mid 1990s. And in the context of Brexit, what you're seeing is that, yes, they've got this profound, deep interconnection with the United Kingdom that has both positive and very fraught elements to it. But they've also built up extremely important ties with the European Union. And so when we think about the place of Ireland today, it sees itself very much as a player on the world stage, heavily invested with people from through foreign direct investment, and tied in diplomatically with the European Union. And I don't know that the United Kingdom fully appreciated that either about the Republic of Ireland as a fully independent entity, or the unity of the European Union. And so we're talking about multiple players here, and over the last 3 years, they've learned a lot about each other and about themselves. And I think that's actually going to be one of the fundamental things that we take away from the last few years.
So just a quick point about this last question. So my understanding is that at least the way Macron sees this is it's in sequential terms, right? So that you would get Brexit done first, and then with that, how long that's going to take, that's a different question, and the aftermath and everything else. But at least his point of view would be that once that is done, then you can go on to reform the European Union. And it seems that his position is one of reforming the architecture of the euro, in essence, to prevent the really negative consequences of asymmetric shocks to the euro economy. Now, whether he could actually muster the support within European countries to actually achieve that, I mean, Germany is weakened politically, but it's hard to see them not fight this. So.
But I want to sort of jump back in now and get to something that we've talked a little bit about in different contexts, but haven't really delved into, which is to talk a bit about sort of the British voter and the changing British voter that we've seen over the past, many years, but over the past few years. We know, for example, that many that voted Remain back in 2016 voted for the Tories in December of 2019, and obviously the Tories are, of course, as we've been talking about, under Boris Johnson, very much pushing and supporting for Brexit. So obviously there's a lot to unpack here, and Pablo, I wonder if you want to jump in.
So one of the interesting aspects of this is that, so you were mentioning it before, right? So you have a cross-cutting cleavage, one that a new line of political conflict, which is Remain versus Leave, that doesn't essentially fold into the left versus right, right? And so you have this potential tensions within party coalitions, right? So you have Remain voters and Leave voters within both parties, but it seems that one of the two has done a lot better at keeping that coalition together. And so it seems that the Conservative Party has done a lot better. So that's one of the intriguing questions of the last election, at least that's one of my readings. The Labour Party has seemingly done a lot worse. One of the big news from election night was how the red wall had collapsed, and so these historically Labour seats in the north had been lost to the Conservatives. These are districts that had voted Leave in the referendum. Now it's not so clear, at least my understanding is that not so clear, because the message from this would be, or one potential reading from this would be, oh, so it's Labour, has a diverse coalition, and it hasn't been able to keep its Leave voters inside the party. It's not clear that they've lost, it seems that they may have lost just as many Leave voters as Remain voters. It's just that Remain, so the voters they have lost in Remain seats are in seats that are safer. These are urban, so it's London, etc., etc. These are voters that have gone to the Liberal Democrats. So these are not seats that Labour has lost, and yet they still have lost quite a few Remain voters. And the potential explanation for that, or one plausible explanation for that, would be that they've been too uncommittal, right? So they've been too uncertain as to what their position on Brexit was. So the question is, how is it that a Conservative Party under Boris Johnson has been able to keep Remain voters in the parliament?
Anand, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, several things. I think, firstly, this has been a long time in the making. I mean, New Labour lost 4 million votes in its time in office, though it tended to lose them to people who decided not to vote rather than people who were willing to switch parties. So there's been a gradual, it's not dissimilar to the history of the Democrats in parts of the United States, in the sense that traditional Labour voters got slightly switched off a party that was seen as out of touch because it was socially liberal, economically liberal, out of touch with their interests and their values. That was happening. It didn't affect Labour that badly. I mean, they lost the 2010 election, but you might have expected that after so long in power and the financial crisis. And then what happened was a lot of those voters went to UKIP. Remember in 2015, 4 million people voted for UKIP, and because of our electoral system, that gave them 1 MP. What's happened because of Brexit is, and it's worth saying, in 2015, I think the SNP got about half the number of votes that UKIP did and got almost 50 MPs because their votes were geographically concentrated. Now, Brexit meant that a lot of those people, because of Boris Johnson, were tempted by the offer of getting Brexit done because it was about a political establishment that wasn't listening to them. And part of this, Theresa May started this. Theresa May made gains in all the red wall seats that Boris Johnson won. She just didn't make sufficient gains. I mean, she got very, very close in a lot of them, but didn't quite get over the winning line, which is why she did badly and Boris Johnson did well, if you like. Boris Johnson finished the process that she started. So the other thing is that Boris Johnson is the Leave camp coalesced inside the Conservative Party because the Brexit Party either died or committed suicide, depending on how you want to see it. Whereas the Remain vote was divided between a whole load of parties: Plaid Cymru, the SNP, the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, and Labour. If you count Labour as a Remain party, and we can talk about that, there were more Remain voters than Leave voters in this election. So there was still a majority that voted for something that you might just about with Labour call Remain, but they were split amongst different parties, which made all the difference. Remember also, a lot of Labour voters simply didn't vote at this election rather than switching to the Conservatives. It's a very messy picture that comes out of this, but there is something happening. And the thing that's happening is, from back in the 1960s when Peter Pulitzer said, if you want to understand British politics, you need to understand class. Something else is happening around values in our politics now that hasn't displaced class, but it sits alongside it in terms of a driving force for our election, which means that places you never thought would be Labour are now Labour, places you never thought would be Conservative are now Conservative. The final thing I'd say, and it's worth saying this because it's not all about the sort of sociology of elections, is that Jeremy Corbyn was absolutely crap and distrusted by the electorate. Boris Johnson was very unpopular with the electorate, but he was significantly more popular than Jeremy Corbyn, who essentially was more unpopular than anyone has ever been ever since we've had numbers.
It's interesting. Well, I was going to say it's interesting to compare the 2017 election and the 2019 election. So to go to Anand's point there about that Johnson essentially consolidated and improved upon what May did in those formerly red districts. One of the things that was so striking about the 2017 election was just how bad a campaigner Theresa May was, right? And so, in spite of Corbyn's weaknesses with the electorate, he looked relatively good. And Johnson, frankly, is the kind of showman that is going to show much better. And the specific weaknesses of Corbyn are going to show much more readily. And excuse me. So, in spite of the fact that Johnson has made a career out of, frankly, lying, saying things. I mean, here's the arch leaver who, on the verge of announcing that he was in favor of leaving the European Union, had actually written 2 editorials, one of which was that we would remain and one that we would leave, and he ultimately opted to vote leave. Right? He is very calculating in that sense, and I don't know that May was ever that calculating, and that actually resonated with people who were in this sort of in-between space. Mentally, how do I vote here? I still see myself as a working person or a person who sees class as central, but I don't see that playing out to my benefit within the European Union. And so I'm going to vote to leave. And I think that's what we saw in the difference between 17 and 19. He was able to.
If you could...
Go ahead.
Yeah. No. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say he was able to consolidate those folks in ways that we hadn't seen before.
Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering if you could comment on the December election in Northern Ireland, in which the non-sectarian or cross-sectarian Alliance Party was able to pick up, if I'm not mistaken, 1, if not 2 seats. And if if you see that as any connection to Brexit, or if that's a part of the larger change in politics in Northern Ireland.
I think it's both. Alliance picked up a seat, and the Social Democratic and Labour Party, the more moderate of the nationalist parties, picked up 2 seats. So I mean, it was a very interesting election in the North, in that for the first time in the history of Northern Ireland, Unionists did not pick up a majority of the seats. Right? It was basically evenly split. 8 seats went to the Democratic Unionists, 7 to Sinn Féin, 1 to Alliance, and 2 to SDLP. As I said earlier, all of the parties across the political divide in Northern Ireland essentially are against the withdrawal agreement as negotiated. The Democratic Unionists were the only party that actually was willing to leave, but under specific conditions, right? Their alliance, if you will, the confidence and supply agreement that they had with Theresa May, I think actually helped serve to undercut their support. In part because once you had the change in prime ministership and Johnson was willing to do a different deal, their, if you will, cachet in London was lessened. They weren't able to deliver for their voters, and that opened the door in part for people who were dissatisfied with them for a number of different reasons. And so you see districts shifting away from DUP into some of these other parties. There is, I think Northern Ireland for its entirety has been seen as essentially 2 camps, right? Nationalists and unionists, unionists being in the majority. But those 2 labels were always umbrellas. They included people with different social concerns and indeed different approaches to politics. And what you've seen over the course, especially of the last 20 years and especially the last 10 years, is, if you will, more of a centrist element, people who just openly say we're neither. And I think that's where you're seeing Alliance gaining some votes. I think that's actually where even the more moderate SDLP is recovering votes as well.
Thank you. So we are quickly running out of time. We're short on time, and of course we could continue this conversation for a while. I do want to get back to something that Anand, Pablo, that you both alluded to, and sort of thinking about what's next with the Labor Party. And as we know, Corbyn announced after following the election that he would step down, given the results of the Labor Party received, which, if I'm not mistaken, were the worst since the 1930s. The Labor Party now is in the midst of a leadership, I don't want to say transition yet, but a leadership conversation over who will take over. And so, Pablo, I wonder if maybe you could give your thoughts a little bit on kind of where Labor is going with this. Are we seeing a realignment within the British electorate?
So, I mean, my take would be that, so the problems that Labour is facing are not particular to the Brexit context, in the sense that the dilemma that Labour faces is very much the dilemma of every social democratic party in Europe, or if you ask me, also the Democratic Party in the US, right? So it's about keeping together a coalition of upper middle class urban cosmopolitans with former working class voters in post-industrial areas, right? And this is a very difficult coalition to hold together, particularly where certain issues are very salient, right? So this is not new, and this is something that the Labour Party is going to have to choose. Now, something that is intriguing is that precisely the Corbyn, so some of the economic policies that Corbyn was putting forward would on the face of them, would be something that appealing to that working class, right? But it failed in part because of the question of Brexit, right? And so it seems that Corbyn, to some extent, although maybe his language was more of the language of urban militants and ideologues more than that of people that actually would be the recipients of these policies. But on the face of them, these policies would be beneficial to working class voters, and at the same time, he's losing many of those voters. So that's very interesting.
Anand, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things. I'm not sure it was Brexit per se. I think actually one of the interesting things about Labour were many of its individual policies were popular, but the party, by which we can say the leader and his gang, were not deemed competent by the British electorate. So on measures of competence, they scored very, very badly. So even those people who liked what they were saying, doubted their ability to do what they had said. And that's even, if you subtract the people who just didn't like Corbyn. And remember, the degree to which people didn't like Corbyn cannot be exaggerated. In 2017, people didn't really know Jeremy Corbyn. By 2019, we'd had the anti-Semitism thing. We'd had also, people on the doorstep saying, I was on several doorsteps in some of those constituencies, and some of the comments you'd hear, and they sound trivial, but, if you know elections, these are the most damning things you can hear. He's scruffy. He doesn't look like a prime minister. He's a threat to national security. Things like that are really, that's what people think of. That's how people think about you in a very profound way. So it was very negative. The future of the Labour Party is going to hinge in part on who gets the leadership. We could have more of the same under Rebecca Longdale, and something slightly different but rather dull under Keir Starmer. I don't think in the field of candidates they've got an obvious winner, but they've got degrees of slightly better than Jeremy Corbyn, which is a start, I suppose. And the party has to think very hard about how to reconnect to, as we just heard, a very broad coalition. Now, remember, the advantage the Labour Party has in the UK is our electoral system. That's why they're not facing the fate that the SPD have in Germany, where basically, the metropolitan sort of liberal socialists go off to the Greens and the rest go off to the far left or the far right. Our election system makes that very, very unlikely. But they have to find a message to reconnect. The problem the Labour Party have, this is one of the interesting conversations you have now amongst Labour circles, is the people who want Boris Johnson to succeed and the people who want Boris Johnson to fail. You know, some people are saying, actually, now that Boris Johnson has stolen all the clothes of the Labour Party, you know, I don't care who does it, as long as someone invests in these communities and gets rid of inequality, that's great. And if it's Boris Johnson, that's fine. To the others who are sort of hoping that he fails and they can fight him on a platform of not delivering, there's a long time till the next election. So it is almost, well, so A, we don't know how well Boris Johnson will do. And B, we almost certainly don't know what the major political issue of the day will be when we vote again. Because if you look at the last few governments that have suffered electoral defeat, John Major, it was the ERM, which no one could have predicted. With Tony Blair, well, he didn't suffer defeat, but it was Iraq that sapped his popularity. With Gordon Brown, it was the financial crisis. With David Cameron, it was the outcome of the referendum. So they're all sort of slightly things that you couldn't have predicted at the start of their reign. But events will take over on this, and basically the Labour Party needs to have someone that people like at the helm. That's the crucial thing about this leadership. They can formulate their precise strategy nearer the time when they know how well Boris Johnson has done, what he's done, and what the events that intervene are.
Thank you. No, that's a really interesting assessment from both of you. And I think at the end of the day, too, what we're hearing is that while Brexit really did play into the fate, in some respects, of the Labour Party, the things that we're seeing across the board that are that social democratic and left of center parties are dealing with across the board, as Pablo said, in Europe, but also in the U.S. And we're seeing that as well in the UK. And so I think that, you know, thinking about kind of I don't want to say perhaps the demise of the Labour Party, but the, you know, slow decline or speedy decline, I suppose, is obviously tied into the specifics of Corbyn and of Brexit, but things that we're seeing elsewhere. And just to kind of return to the 2 points that Anand made, which is that, you know, class is not defining politics anymore, and we keep hearing that, and that really is contributing to kind of the transition, and has contributed to the transition of the Labour Party for years, but also that the electoral rules and the first past the post system in some ways protects the Labour Party, right, and keeps at bay the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, et cetera, that we're, as Anand mentioned, is not what we're seeing in Germany. So we have a few minutes left, and I hope that there are some questions that we haven't gotten to that those that are here and remotely may still have.
Can I go back to Scotland?
Go back to Scotland, yes.
Scotland, they almost were pushing for a second referendum almost immediately. That was Sturgeon has been the main spokesperson for that. If they were to have another referendum, which doesn't sound likely, but if they did, and they lost what, 55 to 45, I think, in 2014, would the SNP just keep on going? I mean, at some point, is there any understanding or recognition among the SNP hardliners that Scotland is better off? What was the phrase they had during the 14 campaign? Better off in Britain as part of Britain. Better together, yeah. So. And then the other flip side of that is, would they really be happier? Would the Scots really be happier? And I'm part Scots here. Would they be happier with the EU than with Westminster? Meaning they would be trading essentially control of their domestic life from Westminster to Brussels. And I just cannot imagine that the Scots, your typical Scot, would think that's fine after what they've gone through with England. So, I mean, it's a sort of an esoteric question, I guess. But is Scotland really that committed?
It's messy in many ways. I mean, remember, you know, over a third of SNP voters voted Leave in 2016. SNP voters then, many of them aren't SNP voters now because the SNP have recruited a whole load of Remain voters. And it's true, you know, if you look at the polling pre-referendum, Euroscepticism, as we used to call it, is as prevalent in Scotland as it is in England. So yeah, Scotland might have problems within the European Union. I think what a defeat in a second referendum would mean is that a third referendum would be a long, long time coming. I don't think it means the party would stop trying to angle for it or making the case. I just think that politically, if you lose a second time, then actually it's going to be very, very hard to resurrect. One of the things that the SNP is finding at the moment, probably for the first time since it won a majority in a parliament in which no one was meant to get a majority, is that it's getting judged on its record. And is vulnerable to its domestic record in a way it hasn't been in the past. So it's in their interest to keep a focus on independence because it keeps the focus away from a domestic policy record that more and more people are starting to question.
this is, the other thing about it, and to go back to your question about turning over their domestic affairs to Brussels rather than London. There is a sizable part of their domestic portfolio that is now handled at Holyrood, right? So, since the late 90s, when the Blair constitutional reforms took place, and you actually have a Scottish Parliament, a Welsh Assembly, and a Northern Irish Assembly, there are at least elements which are under a degree of local control, and that's the record that Anand is talking about. It's not merely the way that they perform at Westminster; it's how they perform on the ground in Scotland itself. So the party is being looked at in multiple levels, and we're not talking about a pure federal system in the sense that the United States has, because of course those governments are devolved, right? Their powers can be taken back, but the fact is that they have, if you will, institutions around which they can create more of a sense of Scottishness, whatever that comes to mean in the 21st century. So that's a dynamic that I think we do need to consider as well.
Thank you. So we are just about out of time. I want to thank Tim and Anand and Pablo for joining us, and this was a very fascinating discussion. I know we could continue the conversation, of course, but we won't. Thank you. I think everyone learned quite a bit, and I think we touched on a lot of the important topics. So thank you again, and thank you to our audience as well.
Thank you for this.
Thank you.